Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Adventurous Club of Los Angeles Thursday night broadcast. We have an interesting program for you tonight, as we do every Thursday night. If you like what you hear tonight, be sure to tune in, subscribe to our YouTube channel, the Adventurous Club of Los Angeles. Also, most of this goes out on podcasts after production, so pick it up, carry it in your car, listen to it on the way to work instead of swearing at the guy next to you. So tonight we have with us John Heinsen.
Hello.
Welcome. He's got an interesting family story that opened up and turned into some really interesting things during his research. So welcome to the club again.
Thank you. It's nice to be back.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm a filmmaker, producer. I'm originally from Chicago. I've been in Los Angeles 25 years. I've worked in everything from live news to the Academy Awards. And so I've always been a big fan of history. And about in 2015, I decided to go on what proved to be a great adventure, kind of digging into my grandfather's World War I experience.
And so lots of people had grandfathers with World War I experience. What was unique about your grandfather and what sparked it?
Yeah, so when I was a kid, my grandfather was a very big part of my life, and his profession was a photographer. And ever since I was a little kid, he had these pictures from World War I. And so if you remember the remake of All Quiet on the Western Front, made in the 1980s with Ernest Borgnine and John Boy from the Waltons, I watched that with my grandfather, and it was like Platoon. Completely freaked him out. And so even though I had looked at the photos with him before, now he took me in and started telling me stories about these photos and about some of his personal experiences. So that, and some of them were quite emotional. So this is something I had carried with me. And so in 2014, there was a conference held at the World War I Museum in Kansas City. And it was really historians from all over the world coming together talking about how are we going to memorialize World War I. And I was probably the only non-museum person there. It was just kind of this funny thing. But the real thing that they said that was so interesting to me and really tapped something within me was this idea that they felt 100 years later it was those personal individual stories that was the real important thing to tell. And so that's what really got me on this idea of trying to reconnect with my grandfather's wartime experience. So I go to film festivals all over the world, and so I had decided that I was going to go to France to try to find where some of these photos were. And so my 14-year-old son and I were in Estonia for a film festival. And so November of 2015, we decided we were going to land in Frankfurt, go up through Belgium, down to Paris, and see what we could find. But there was a big problem. We got to Frankfurt 3 days after the terror attack at the Bataclan in Paris. This huge, terrible terrorist attack where there were soldiers in the streets and people were running around. And if you remember that time, they thought the bad guys were in Belgium and the country was basically shut down. So now here we are figuring out what are we going to do. So we had to change our entire itinerary, and it was because of that that we ended up finding where the pictures were taken, very much by chance. So I don't know if we have any of the pictures I brought. Oh, good. Can you go back? Hopefully that isn't the first one. No? Okay. Maybe it is. Okay, so here's a picture that my grandfather took in the town of Le Cateau. Can you go to the next picture, please? Nope, they're out of order. That's okay. Oh, here we go. Nope, that's out of order too. That's all right. So
if you can describe the picture, I can probably find it.
They're in numerical order. So if you sort them, we're perfect.
Gotcha. Okay. Give me 1 second then.
No worries at all. So literally what happened is I was in this city in France. We were south of Belgium. We went to Bastogne and then down. And so I had 3 roads I could take to get to where I was going. And I asked the lady at the hotel which road I should take. She said, take this one. And it is only because of that one that I found where the pictures are taken. So here's a picture of my grandfather, 17 years old. He was drafted at the age of 16. His older brother, who was beyond fighting age, was a photographer. And so my grandfather, having a 6th grade education, became an apprentice at his studio. So in the last 18 months of World War I, they had lowered the draft age to 16, and so he was drafted in. Now, because he had been an apprentice for a couple of years in photography, he was saved from the trenches and now went to this more dangerous job, if you go to the next picture, and he was a aerial observer. So that is not a picture of him, But that is his life. Much greater adventure than I'll ever have, but that was his adventure. And so if you know anything about aerial aviation and actually how it became important in World War I, you had the stalemate of the trenches. And so the aerial photography was very important because it was better than any map. And so what they would do is they would photograph the trenches, and he was actually assigned to an artillery unit. They would photograph the trenches, they would scale it, and that's how they would lob over the shells in advance of an attack. So for the opposition, it was very important that those planes did not get back. And that's why planes started shooting at each other. So if you think about somebody like Richtoven, who we're going to talk about later, he actually was originally an observer, but then later he was a fighter. So the planes would come in very even, and the minute there were enemy fighters, the same side of fighters would go in and attack, and the planes would try to get away. So that was the job he had. So this is the town of Le Cateau, the town that I got to. I had pulled into this town. I was very interested in this arch. It was the only reason why I stopped to get out of the car. I maybe wouldn't have gotten out of the car anyway. This town has no McDonald's, no hotel kind of thing. And so all of a sudden I get to this town, and here's this picture. Go to the next picture, and I go, oh my God, I've seen this before. And if you can go to the next one, the black and white one, there's the same picture. So it is all exactly the same. So what had been the Archdiocese in 1917 is today the National Museum for Matisse. He is from this village, and from the 1950s it has been a world-class museum on par with the Norton Simon in Pasadena. They have special trains on Paris to bring you up to this town, this museum on the weekends, and otherwise there ain't nothing in the town. So the person you're going to see there with the sash at the bottom, that's General Rupert, which was the commander of the 2nd Army Group. And so here's this in Le Cateau. And so it's absolutely crazy, right? So I'm in this town. I now found where the pictures are taken. I had no evidence to get me there otherwise. I don't speak French. So what do? I have this conscious moments of what do I do? So I realized because of the museum, I bet the head librarian speaks English. So I go and I find the head librarian. I talk to her. I'm showing her the pictures. She's getting all excited. She picks up the phone. She calls her husband. He runs over. They talk French for like 3 minutes. The husband runs us down the street, my son and I, knocks on the door. The guy opens the door in perfect English. Come in, come in. It's the mayor of the town. So now we are sitting with the mayor of the town, very lovely gentleman. Now his wife is there. She's looking at pictures. Now the archbishop comes. Now all these other old French people come. They're making us sandwiches. It's crazy. So now if you can go to the next picture, please. So many of the pictures that I have in my grandpa's archive, which is about 200 photographs, include pictures of Kaiser Wilhelm. And so for the most part, I had thought that these pictures had never been published, but they were. And so the Kaiser being in this town in Le Cateau was very well known to the city's history that he had been there. There were no known photographs. Now this picture, which you'll see published on the cover there, is Cambrai. Cambrai was a major battle in November of 1917. These pictures were associated with the battle, but they actually were taken in this little town of Le Cateau behind the lines, because the Kaiser being in that town was part of a secret meeting that there are no records of, and my pictures prove it. So now I realize these pictures are published. So because I have this connective tissue of the town and of the Kaiser and this battle and this date, I start digging in. Now if you can go to the next picture. So I find this picture that is taken of Kaiser there, and it's behind that museum that you saw before, the Kaiser and all the big generals. And you're going to see in the background, there is a guy with a camera. Now, if you look in the center of the photo, you're going to see a guy in the back with a drape over his head. That is a movie camera. And actually, this image you're looking at now is a movie still image. In fact, I have this movie footage. So now, if you go to the next picture, you're going to see the image from that camera in the very back. And there's the Kaiser, and there's my grandfather holding the camera. And that was my eureka moment. And you go to the next picture really quick. And of course, it's all still the same. Everything is exactly the same. It's pretty crazy. So now I realize, oh my God, I've made this great connection, right? So now I want to dig deeper. What's going on? This is kind of where my adventure begins. So go to the next one, please. So this is the Battle of Cambrai. So if you know anything about World War I, this whole idea of trench warfare. And so this is November of 1917, when everything's getting cold and the trench fighting stops. So the British, who had invented the tanks, not the Germans, had decided to attack. And they attacked with 400 tanks against the Hindenburg Line and basically freaked out the Germans, just rolled right through. In fact, they captured 9,000 Germans on the first day. And so what happened was they bulged through, the original bulge, right? So they bulged through and they're aiming towards Cambrai, which was a major German city. And it really could have been a turning point in the war. So now they're 7 days into the battle, and at a certain area known as Berlin Wood, the Germans actually captured a German tank that they could drive. And they took the tank behind the lines to Le Cateau, and that's why the Kaiser was there. They were all checking out firsthand this new weapon they were facing. So what happened was they had this tank, and there's film footage of them driving this tank. They found the weakness in the tank. The side armor was very small, very thin. So 3 days later, they counterattacked, if you go to the next picture, and basically they destroyed every tank.
Wow.
They destroyed every tank. So the furthest most point of advance of the tanks was the end of the battle. And then they basically destroyed the tanks, went through, captured thousands and thousands of British soldiers, and basically returned the line past the center. So now what happened was, on my second trip to France, I was now researching this battle. And so interestingly, everything I had heard was about one individual that had written a book all about the tank battle. He was a local historian, had all the detail, had the name of every guy in every tank. And so the thing was, the book was out of print. You couldn't find the book anywhere. So I start researching and I find out, I see in a blog post or a posting or whatever, that the guy that wrote the book owns a hotel. So I booked a room in the hotel. And I wrote the guy, and I said, hey, I'm a historian, I've got some pictures, I'd love to talk to you about your book. He became very French and said, why do you want my book? And all this kind of stuff. Yeah. And it was back and forth, and maybe I don't want you at my hotel. It was a whole crazy thing. And it was very funny, and we've become excellent friends. And so through this whole thing, I show up at the hotel, and there's a knock at my door. And he goes, you want to see my book? And he hands me the book through the door. I'll talk to you later. And basically, he closed the door, and I photographed the whole book. So I got the book, which is still out of print.
So his distrust was well-founded.
Yes. So it's all good. So his research, now you'll see on this picture here of the tank, it says B-28. Those were the tanks and the numbering and whatnot. You're also going to see there's a dead British soldier. These pictures, what I've now learned from the historians that I've dealt with, I can date these photographs within a 4-day window. Because what happened was the counterattack happened on November 30th, but the battle ended 4 days later when it snowed. And so none of my pictures have snow in them. It dates the pictures within 4 days, which I'll explain in a second. Now, if you go to the next picture, this guy's book, which actually helped me immensely, basically has all of the official British records from after the war. Because a lot of these tank wrecks weren't taken away till the 1920s. So in them doing a post-mortem of this tank assault, they identified the tanks, and so you're going to see in the middle here, it says B-28. And so now I know exactly where the photo's taken.
Wow.
So it helped me immensely connecting to all the photos, and actually most of the tanks in that image I have photos of. So what I learned was this: after the German counterattack, the Germans were fascinated with these tanks, and they were obsessed with them. And so what they did is, in a scramble, because they didn't know what was coming next with the British, they grabbed every photographer they could and put them on trucks, took them out into the field to document the tanks. And that's where my grandfather's pictures came from. He was actually stationed nearby at an airfield. In fact, the reason why he was there with the Kaiser was he was not part of the Kaiser's entourage. He was stationed at the closest airfield to that city. And most likely what happened is the commander went, and so therefore he went with him. And that's how he got those pictures of the Kaiser. And so he was put on a truck and sent out into the field. So you can go to the next picture, please. So everybody thinks about the romanticism of aerial combat in World War I. That is actually what it was like. It was complete mayhem and pandemonium. It was utter terror and utter death. The average life expectancy was 3 weeks, and it was a young man's game. Manfred Richtofen, the celebrated pilot of World War I, was 25 years old when he died. It was really something. Wow. So my grandpa being 17 was really nothing special. If you can go to the next one, please. So he was an aerial photographer. So these are the maps that he would do. You'll see up at the top there's metadata. Metadata was a big thing then. So it would have the name of the unit, it would the altitude, the map coordinates, and then even an arrow for north. So this is Amiens. If you look at the upper left, you'll see the cathedral. So with Google Earth, I was able to take all of his aerial photographs and match them perfectly today. So in my next trip to France, I went for 3 weeks in the summer, got a little Toyota, drove around like a crazy man, and went all over the place. And so I had this new adventure related to my grandpa's war experience, where I would go where he took an aerial photograph, and I would literally jump out of the car, run in the middle of the field, and I'd be finding ordnance and human remains and all this crazy stuff. So I was in this one particular town, and I was out in the middle of a field, and it's Iowa, there's nothing out there. And what you learn, and if you look at actually a map of France, go home and go to Google Earth, you'll see these tree lines that are all curved. Those are filled in trenches from World War I today. So you could really see where it all is if you really look. So I'm in the middle of this field, and it's bright, sunny June day, and a tractor pulls up. And the guy says in perfect English, "It's a long way to walk from your car to hang a piss in my field," is what he said. And I said, no, I'm here doing this. And so I show him the pictures. I have a big tablet. I'm showing him the pictures. He goes, "I've been here all my life. I find crap all the time. I never knew there was a trench right here." He said, "Jump on." And he jumped on and I jumped on the tractor. And so he took me out to his property, and there was a pillbox. And he said, "You should look around here. This is where I find stuff." So there was a British pillbox, and I'll never forget it. I was walking around, and I found a bone. I found the top of a human leg bone. And it was absolutely horrifying. And it really, really hit me. I wasn't expecting it. I don't know why I wasn't expecting it, but I was not expecting finding that leg bone. And I felt guilty even taking a picture of it, which I don't have here to share, but because I don't want to share it. But so what I did was, the British are different than the Americans and French. The British believe you should be buried as close to where you fell. So if you go to the upper parts of France, you will see a cemetery with 20 guys from 1915, and 1,000 yards away, another cemetery of 30 guys from 1917. That's how it was. So I took that leg bone and I buried it in a British cemetery. And this began this journey that I had of this human connection to the land. Can you go to the next photo, please? These are the cameras they used. You hear about Zeiss lenses when you're buying a camera now? They had Zeiss lenses then. These are immensely large cameras. If you can come back to me for a second. This is actually what the cartridges were like. The photographs I have are immensely high quality because they were glass plate. They were not film. There would be a glass plate in here. You'd put it into the camera, you would expose it, take your picture, and close it back. And this would go into a case, and this would get delivered.
Would you mind holding it in front of your...
That would be one image. So what I have are basically contact prints of that large glass plate, and that's why my photographs are such high quality, and really, in most instances, don't exist, because most things that do exist are published photographs, but this is the original asset.
John, would you mind holding that up in front of you for the folks at home?
Absolutely. Which camera? Side?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the cartridge. So pretty crazy.
How many would they carry it?
They'd have like a little suitcase. Yeah, and then the airplane, they would have them and whatnot. That's why the pictures of the Kaiser and whatnot that I have are such high quality, because he had the cameras that they used in the airplanes. That's why it was such high quality.
I think I'd be a little nervous hanging out the side of an airplane with a camera that large.
So they would, they'd rig it.
Pull you out.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Pretty crazy. Yeah, it was definitely a big adventure for him. You know what I mean? If you go to the next one, please. So this is a picture that actually was published. I found this in a German archive. He was he was an army photographer, so his pictures did get published. But this picture is in his album. This picture is very unique. In fact, this is Belgium. I have identified the location. I've actually stood on the ground where this tank is. What's unique about this photo is he is very low, and that was very unusual at the time. So here is the tank going as it is. All those little things you see around the tank are a swarm of German soldiers basically shooting into the tank to kill the 10 guys in there. Wow. And that, they said, was very unusual. They all swarmed the tank to try to stop it. And there's a memorial for the crew of that tank at that location.
So there were 10 people inside the tanks?
Yes.
Wow.
So in that German counterattack, like I said, how they were able to take a shell, it was actually an artillery shell designed to hit airplanes. It had a special kind of altitude. And they realized that they shot that at the side of the tank, it would go inside and cook everybody instantly. It was actually a horrible death. So you can go to the next picture, please. So now this. So this is a picture of Manfred Richtofen. This picture was published widely in 19 after his death. It's one of the most famous photographs ever taken outside of a studio environment of Richtofen. This picture was taken at the airbase at Boisternecourt, which is between the first town of Le Cateau and the town of Cambrai. This picture is in my grandfather's album. And so when I would meet people and talk about this photograph, I would say my grandfather took the photograph. And they'd say, well, how do you know your grandfather took the photograph? And I said, well, I have the outtakes. So I have several photographs of that same moment. Richtoven by that point was at the peak of his power. And so he was basically, instead of just a squadron commander, he was the commander of several units. So he would go to visit. So there was a speculation about who Richtoven is speaking to in this photo. Historians have been questioning it for years. My photographs prove who he's speaking to, and it's not the person they thought it was, which is really interesting. And it also, the reverse, if you go to the next picture, please. And so in my travels about Richtoven, I would go to all the airfields. This is actually one of the chateaus that they would live at. That's how they determined where they were going to fly. They'd have to have a chateau because this was a gentleman's sport, as it were. And they would drink their wine. At home. They'd put on their scarf and go out to the plains and fly off and do their thing. And so all of these chateaus, you could drive right through these villages you wouldn't know, and then you go to the chateaus. So I had tracked all these different airfields as they were. And it was quite an amazing, experience of doing that, connecting to Richtoven. Although I think it was only in that one particular instance where my grandfather was with him, kind of thing.
So are there still remnants of the airfields near these chateaus that you went to, or
no? They're
is that all gone?
Yeah, no. It's really interesting. I mean, they're basically crops, or grazing land. If you go to the next one, please.
Just a field.
Yeah. Field. Sure.
Here's a picture of that airfield where the picture's taken. You'll see that those were the grounds. They would build the hangars and whatnot. This particular airfield, Boisternicourt, is actually very famous because the most successful unit in World War I, called the Greentails, was stationed there. And actually, if any of your kids are at home playing the World War I video game, you land at that airfield in the video game. That's how famous it was. Can you go to the next one, please? And here's a picture of my kids and I talking to a horse on that airfield today. So we would go there, and of course people drive by every day. They don't know the history in these places. It was really important to me, and with my kids and everything, to really about the idea of feeling the history, about really experiencing it. And so that's that combination of my grandfather's photographs and my research. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the next one, please. I know there's a lot of photos. I apologize. This is actually the airfield, the field where Richtoven was shot down and killed. And so basically what had happened was he had gotten disoriented, and he actually thought he was flying back to his lines, and he actually flew over the Australians and was mortally shot. And he actually did land. He didn't crash. He landed and then died, and that is the airfield. So it's pretty amazing and fun for the kids. They've been talking in their classes at school about how they really got to see it.
It's one thing to look at a photo, but
yes,
something tangible, the smells, the sights.
That's
all
right.
That. Yeah.
That's right. If you go to the next one, please. I know there's a lot of photos. I'm sorry. So this gives you an idea of the extent of with the research when you're really going out there and doing the adventuring, as it were. This is a German trench map, the Hindenburg Line, and you're going to see all these different trenches, communication trenches, pillboxes, and so literally you go out there and you run around, and all that stuff is still there. Literally, the pillboxes are there in the fields, and there's ordnance there, and all the crazy things. And so and so you encounter all of these people as you go, the different farmers and things like that.
So they're just vast swaths of battlefield that people just don't even go into. Understand.
Yes.
Because of all the remnants.
That's right. If you look at a map of France, actually a freeway map, and you'll see the center of France, I think it's the A1 or the A3, that is actually the no man's land of the Western Front, because they can't farm there, they can't do anything there. So they cleared out just enough ordnance to put in the freeway, but it's pretty dangerous. People die still to this day from farmers will hook a mine or something like that. Yeah.
It's going to pull off the side of the freeway there.
No. And so the farmer will just take the ordnance, and if it doesn't kill him, they'll put it on the side of the road, and the army will come and pick it up. It's pretty crazy. So if you can go to the next one, please. So this is kind of what my life was like for 2 years. I literally would pull on a country road, usually getting stuck in the mud. And so you'll see there that right on top of my car there, that's a particular wood that I was able to identify in a battle map. And then you're going to see that grouping of trees. Well, that grouping of trees is not a grouping of trees. It is actually a trench. And it's quite a complex trench. And actually underneath it to both sides is a complete bunker complex. If you go to the next photo, please. This is what it was like during the war. And so literally they just closed it up. All that stuff is still down there.
Really?
Nobody's even trying to go clean it up.
Wow.
And so when I was there in November of 2017, I actually met the descendants of the British that actually attacked that trench. And there's literally firsthand accounts, which was fascinating to read, about, we went in and we killed the guy at the door and then went inside and ate his dinner and smoked his cigars. And because this was not a frontline trench, this was where they'd relax. There were hospitals and stores and supplies and but because they had bulged through with these tanks, they were able to go in. So again, this combination of field work and then research allows you to go in and you find all sorts of things. A lot of times in these French farm fields, and like I said, I don't speak French, every once in a while I'll be around a farm field at dusk, I hear a shotgun go off, and I realize it's time to leave.
Yes.
So that actually happens to me quite a bit.
Quit hanging around.
Quit hanging around. What are you doing? So that kind of thing is pretty crazy. Actually, if you can go to the next one, please. And this, if you know where to look, is what you'll find. So these are literally trenches that just never got filled in. This is literally how it is. It's pretty amazing. Usually in a map of France, if you see a wooded area, the reason why it's wooded is that there might be a geographical feature, like a rocky kind of thing where they can't farm. Or in other instances, it's because it's where there's the battlefield. There could be a large crater there, there could be ordnance there, there could be mustard gas there. You really have to know what you're doing. You cannot just go and run around, because the problem is, and I was telling the story at dinner, very famous story about a historian where they had exhumed some graves from 1914, and they were elaborate Prussian uniforms. And this historian was so excited to find out where these soldiers were from, he had rubbed the belt buckle on the skeleton, and he got the mustard gas and he died. Because the poison's still there. They call it the dead zones, especially in the south near Verdun. Not so much where I am, the area that I explore, but you have to know what you're doing, and if a shell is dangerous or not. And actually, most of the shells, to some extent, can be dangerous because there is some toxic, but the mustard stuff is very bad. Yep. The next one, please. This is kind of a funny story. I know tonight we were talking about stories. I had my 14-year-old son with me, and I had done some research. And so if you know the marginal line, which people know about, it was a series of French installations, and they were created after the Franco-Prussian War. And so I had researched some of this, and now some of them are for tourists, and some of them are for not. And so I knew where this was, and so I found this. So what you're seeing there is the entrance to a bunker complex that basically is filled in. There would be all the ordnance and people inside, and then they'd come outside where the large guns were. And so that is a 12-foot opening that is basically 10 feet filled. And so I came prepared with my flashlight and my 14-year-old son, and basically saw him shit a brick when I said, "We're going in." And I shimmied in and dropped down. If you go to the next one, please. That's what it was like inside.
Oh, wow.
So we go in there, and it had been raining. Everything inside was dry. There was no graffiti. There was no collapse. So I knew we were okay. We would go in, and I have a whole series of photographs. You'd go in, there'd be a defensive position, like with a bullet, area, covered in bullet holes. It clearly had been assaulted. You go into a room, like a side room there, that would have ceilings higher than this. They probably had 50 people sleeping in there. And we went in, and there were tracks, and I knew that's where they would bring the ordnance in and out. Well, we got into a certain point, and we're going in quite deep. Kind of scary. My son was freaking out. It was great. And then I saw that it went off. We were going straight in, but then it went off to the side. So I said, let's turn. So we go off into the side, and all of a sudden, I got into another intersection, and I realized it was kind of like an H. So we basically went down and then back up out the front, shimmied through the hole, and came out a quarter mile down the road and hiked back to our car.
Wow.
So all these places are still there. They really don't want you in there. And of course you can get hurt, but anyway, it was great for my son. A great experience for him, a great bonding experience. So that's really what a lot of that's like. You know what I mean? I think that it was this combination of me trying to connect with my grandfather's war experience, but now I was seeing, because I was having all this connection to the history and the things I was experiencing, what do I want to do with that? Because I'm a filmmaker, right? So you can go to the next one, please. And again, it's just another, like one of the bunkers you'd find. You'd go in the woods. There's a bunker. Next one, please. There's a bunch of these. And so this was my son. So that literally there is a trench. where they plant the trees in there, and you're going to see there are the artillery shells. They're basically like a giant shotgun shell full of buckshot that they would shoot up and it would blast down. The farmer just throws them there. Those are my boys. My son found this on the right. Actually, it's kind of funny. It was about as big as a basketball, and so I moved the grass aside there, and I'm seeing it there, and in this trench, and I was scared to pull on it. I didn't know what it was. So I showed a historian later what it was. Mm-hmm. It was basically sitting there 100 years, a unused roll of German barbed wire. Oh. Sitting there for 100 years. Wow. Pretty crazy. So this is the kind of stuff that's out there. People really don't go out there. Go to the next one, please. This is and then again, you just know where to go, all these bunkers and things. These aren't tourist things. This is just the stuff that you go out and find. You have to really do the research on the battlefield maps, not the tourist maps, the battlefield maps. Yeah. It's the exact same thing I'd recommend if you were going to go to Bastogne or something like that. You've got to really do the historical at the time research. The next one, please. And this is what the ordnance is like. So these are the shells the farmers get. They put them on there. You'll see the fuse on the top. In fact, I brought with me, this is actually my best find. This is actually an artillery fuse, a British artillery fuse from World War I that I found, sitting on the ground like a potato. Didn't dig for it, just bubbled up. And so...
Wasn't attached to the rest of it, I presume.
No, they would... so actually, these were, later in the war, these were kind of faulty. They would fall off. Oh. The problem with all this ordnance is that about 20% of the shells they shot in World War I didn't go off. So that was the problem. And you'll see the heads on these are corroding. So they're very dangerous. And even if you take your cell phone up close to them, the magnet in your phone could set them off. A couple of guys have died from that. So basically the farmers put them there and they pick them up, and you'll be in the middle of nowhere, and it'll be down like at Seal Beach when you see those ammunition bunkers, and they go out there and they blow up this ordnance all the time. They just blow stuff up. It's pretty crazy. So they call it the Iron Harvest. They're 100 years in. They think it's going to last another 200 years. Really something. Really something. And it's just never going to end. And it just reminds, and people there are sick of it. It's their history, but it's not like Gettysburg where you find a musket ball. It's killing people. The next one, please. So this is another funny story. So there's a town that is south of Le Cateau, where my grandfather was stationed. Mm-hmm. It's the town of St. Quentin, Saint-Quentin. And it's the only town in the Hindenburg Line, only major town the Hindenburg Line went through. So it was basically a fortress city, as it were. And so I had pictures of my grandfather's that were labeled St. Quentin. So I went to the town with my son, and we ended up being able to find where pictures were taken. So if you go, you'll see this photo album here. I'll come back to that, but go to the next one, please. So I'm here with my son, and as you'll see, there's 2015 and there's 1917, and it's all basically the same. So I'm in this town, and I'm like, wow, this is the same. This picture's the same. So I go, and I mark on the map where a picture's taken, and then the next picture, and then the next picture, and then guess what? It makes a circle. Oh. So my grandfather was there for probably a couple hours. Mm-hmm. And so I had to hypothesize what was he doing there. So what I found out is that this city, there were a lot of meetings held there. If you go to the next picture, please. So some of these pictures I had actually include officers. And these officers in this picture in the town square are posing. So I thought maybe he was there escorting these prisoners, or these officers, and he was documenting their trip. So on my last trip to Saint-Quentin, I met with the chief historian, a young guy, and I'm showing him my pictures. And he goes, I've seen these before. And I go, you have? I don't know, right? Okay, you've seen these before. He goes, where are these from? He goes, these are from my book that I published 2 years ago. Oh. And I said, well, that's crazy. He goes, where did you get your pictures from? He goes, they're from the Historical Society. They have an album. Oh. So if you can go back 2 pictures, please, to the couple. So I go to the Historical Society, and they have this little album. And 80% of the pictures in the album are my grandpa's pictures. Wow. So now I say, where did you get the album? A German family donated it in the 1960s. Now go back 2 pictures. I think my grandpa made that album for one of the men in that photo. Oh. Wow. And so now I'm talking to the city about doing an exhibition about it, which is pretty amazing. Wow. You know, that he, and so the first picture in this photo album is a group of soldiers. Mm-hmm. And so written at the bottom of the picture says the town of Caudry. Caudry is the town next to the airfield where my grandpa was stationed 2 hours away. Oh. So I think that's what it was. An officer from cadre that he escorted down, documented, he made in the book.
Wow.
Pretty crazy.
Fascinating.
Okay, next one, please. So now I have been running around like a crazy man. I've been to France over 10 times in a couple of years. Every chance I had to go, I went. And so in November of 2017, I was invited by the French government to do a presentation as part of the official commemorations of the 100-year anniversary of this battle, the Battle of Cambrai. I was the only person presenting that represented the German perspective on the battle. Because this was part of the tank corps, they had all these big British generals there. They had actually units that had come from Afghanistan, frontline tank units that were honored by being a part of this whole thing. And all these commemorations, very, very big deal. A lot of reenactors. Go to the next one, please. It was actually very funny because here they had Germans, they had British guys, and all of them spoke French. You couldn't talk to these guys. They're all French guys running around. It was pretty wacky. They even had a Mark IV tank, Mark IV tank they were driving around, a replica and whatnot. So that was really cool. And so, next one, please. Oh, and so I had a friend follow along. You might recognize this guy, Alan Smith,
Yep.
Adventurers Club president. So Alan actually came along. His sister gave him airline miles. He said, I'm coming. And so Alan was there with me and documented me as I was there for part of this 100th year anniversary. So thank you to Alan, wherever you are.
Yeah, and thank you, Alan, for the referral.
Yes, no, it's very great. So this was, he said, you're going on an adventure? Hell, I'm coming. That was basically what he said. So he was there with me running around all these battlefields and stuff. He was getting all excited about it. Very neat. Next one, please. So I did this talk to a room about this big, and it was a group of British descendants. And so after the talk, most of the people there were older, and I had a lot of the pat on, good job, old boy. I had a lot of that going on. And then the next day, because of that, I was invited to do something very special. If you go to the next one, please, I think. Oh, no, go back. Sorry, I took it out. I tried to. So the morning after, which was the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Cambrai, I joined a group of about 150 descendants at 5 in the morning in a village, and we walked 100 years to the minute the path of the tanks as they attacked.
Wow.
And we ended up in that trench I showed you before the picture, and that's where we were reading journals. 100 years to the minute, and people were crying. It was really, I was the only German there, only American there. It was crazy. Very exclusive event. So now we've come up out of that trench I showed you before, and this woman right here, my soul sister Lucy, she comes up and she says, I need to hold on to your arm. And I said, okay, well, I have a thing for redheads. This is perfect. Grab onto my arm. So she grabs onto my arm and she starts telling me about her grandfather. So she actually was an honored guest at this event. Her grandfather was a very highly decorated tank commander in this battle. And she said, I want to tell you the story of my grandfather. And so we're walking down this road, and she said, right over there, right there is where his tank was hit. His tank was hit. He was literally one of the only ones that survived. And he lived his entire life with survivor guilt in a lot of ways. You know what I mean? So Lucy did not know her grandfather, but she said, I came here to heal for my grandfather. And she said, I've been here, I've seen everything, the whole thing. And she said, it wasn't until I heard your talk that I knew you were the one to heal for my grandfather. And she gave me a hug. I had been struggling on, okay, I've made this connection to my grandpa's experience. What's the story I want to tell? And there's a guy by the name of Mitchell Block, who was the former head of documentary at USC, Oscar winner. And he said, don't do documentaries about dead people, do them about living people. And so the minute Lucy hugged me, I knew I had my documentary. So my documentary film is about one picture. Go to the next picture, please. This is a picture of 30 British prisoners that were captured in the counterattack of the Battle of Cambrai. The picture is of what I now know to be mostly officers. And so my documentary is, I am going to find the families of these 30 men and bring this picture to them 100 years later.
Wow.
And so now we're getting to a year later, we're getting right up on the verge of the centenary. And I had been on a podcast for a charity there called There or Not There, that's endowed by the Royal Trust and all this kind of stuff. Big charity in England. And I did my talk, and there was an author friend of mine, John Taylor, who'd written a book about this tank battle. And he said, let me look at your picture. And he looks at the picture and he goes, you know, some of these guys with their uniforms, I might be able to identify them. And so he calls me up. I'm getting ready to come back to England for the 100th anniversary. I decided I was going to be in London, not in France. And I get there and he goes, I found one of your guys. And I said, okay. So now if you look in the picture there, there's the one gentleman off to the right, or left, has his arm up. And it's because he has his arm up that you can tell his rank, because the rank is on the sleeve.
Sure.
And because of his service ribbons in the picture, we were able to find him, because he had actually fought in the Boer War, which was very unusual. So now I know it's hard to tell in this wider picture, but he has these kind of droopy dog eyes. And so my researcher, go to the next picture, please. We found the granddaughter. And so there's the granddaughter of that man in that photo. We connected with her, and now that's a gentleman from the charity, this charity in England. And we ended up being on national news that evening, which was great. And then we were telling her the story of her grandfather. She did not know her grandfather. We basically brought him back to life for her. And so it was this really amazing thing. Next picture. And so because of that, the next day, the 100th anniversary of World War I, my story made page 3 of the Sunday Telegraph.
Oh.
And so that was an amazing, amazing thing in England. And so we basically were trying to crowdsource the documentary. So since then, I think we've identified 6 of the people. So the idea is, it's this idea of trying to redefine remembrance through a human connection. Because here it is, the war to end all wars, and 100 years later, we're nowhere closer to peace. And so how can we memorialize the sacrifice of this generation on all sides? There really were no winners. That's the big thing you learn when you're standing in a field full of mud 100 years later where all these people died. It was just terrible. And so the idea is, wouldn't it be great to know that these people that met as enemies, their grandchildren meet in peace? And so that's the documentary. That's the documentary. So the next one, please. So now this is actually now a second project that I'm working on that actually I have a lot more to it. So in the Battle of Cambrai, which a lot of people do not know, and are we okay on time?
Yes.
Okay. So Cambrai was actually the first time that Americans ever faced the Germans face to face. And so the U.S. declared war in August of 1917. They didn't fight until early 1918, but a group of 30 men, 30 railroad engineers from New York City, were assigned to the British and were involved at the Battle of Cambrai. So what happened was, when the British tank bulged through, they damaged the railroad tracks. And so they brought these American engineers in to basically fix the tracks because they were going to need them. Well, now, 4 days later, when the Germans counterattacked, they came over the ridge, and there were these Americans.
Bad luck for them.
So they basically dropped their shovels, picked up rifles. A third were killed, a third were captured, and a third got away. This is the only picture of the third that were captured. Now, this picture was published and lost in the 1920s. This picture is in my grandpa's album. He took the picture of the first Americans. So now, as a second documentary, I'm going to find the families of these 30 men. Now, how is that going to be? If you can go to the next one, please. I actually have the, so now when you go to the railroad tracks, that is actually a U.S. Army repair that's still on the tracks today. They haven't been used since the 50s. So literally, it's all the same where they're at. And so what I was able to find was the Red Cross records of those American POWs. I have all of their names, all of their addresses, all of it. And there's a wonderful charity called Purple Hearts Reunited. So literally, if you find a Purple Heart somewhere, they'll help get it back to the family. They're helping me to find the families of these men. And the idea of trying to, because in America, remembrance is so different than in England. You know, British were so proud. The French, you know, it's their whole identity. The Germans had no official commemorations for World War I. Their president was in London, and Merkel was with Macron in France. And even here in the US, they still can't raise enough money to have the memorial in Washington. It's really kind of terrible. So the idea is, how do we redefine this remembrance through a human connection? You know what I mean? It's so hard 100 years later. For me, being someone that's 50 years old that actually knew a World War I veteran, you know, it's very unusual. Usually it's quite extended. And there really aren't photographs. There's maybe letters and stories and whatever. If you go to the next one, please.
Now, do you find, quick side tangent.
Yeah, please.
Do you find when you connect with these people that there's much knowledge of what went on with their grandfathers or whatnot?
Well, so that's kind of the idea of what I'm hoping with the documentary. There's some people that are going to know and some people that aren't. And one of the things that's really interesting, when I was first finding out the information about the one guy that we found, you know, kids are really amazing. My 8-year-old at the time said, "Dad, you're bringing him back to life." And that's kind of what it is. You know, it said that the Egyptians believed that every man died twice. The first time his body died, and the last time the last person said his name. So my documentary is that the descendant of a German is going to bring 30 British soldiers home to England 100 years later. And that's what I want to do.
I love that theme.
Yeah, so that's the idea. This is another funny story. Again, all this crazy stuff that happens. You literally go, you jump out of the car, you find something. It's just crazy. So I was up early in the morning, and you'll see there the road was wet. And so there was a car blocking the road. It's like 6 in the morning. So I said, okay. So I pull off to the side, and the car sinks into the mud. My little car. And I'm like, crap. And I was supposed to be somewhere. The whole thing was terrible. And so now here comes the guy walking down the road with his shotgun and his 2 dogs. The guy on the right there, or the left there, whatever. So the guy with the hood. And so he goes, this is his car. And he goes, oh, you're stuck. This is so terrible. I have a friend. He can help you. Let's have a beer. No good hunting today. So we have a beer. Then we have a second beer. Then we have a third beer. And I said, can we call your friend? Sure, let's have a beer.
Nobody cares about the car.
So now here comes the tractor, the little tractor with this other very nice other French gentleman, young guy. And he goes, oh, you guys are having beer. Let's have a beer. So now I have 3 beers with this guy. So now they strap up the axle of my car to the little tractor and somehow get it out of the mud. And they get me back on the road and send me on the way. And I couldn't drive. I had to sit there another hour to sober up. It was terrible. I was drunk at 8 in the morning on a French farm road.
To say their cousins down the road are waiting to write the ticket.
Yeah, I know, exactly. It was really crazy. And I'm sure it was a hell of a story for them about, the American this and that. What's really interesting about the people there, and I think really kind of the spirit of all of this, is that, I meet people that are interested in the history, people that aren't interested in the history. And this is France, where a lot of terrible things happen. And a lot of those terrible things were done by German people. And I've only been met with kindness. People that see that I'm very sincere in honoring everyone, and I'm an American. My grandpa came to the U.S. when he was 23. He's American. He lived his whole life here. So I mean, so it's really this thing. And I've heard stories where they'll have German tourists that will go to these battlefield sites. They'll go to visitor centers and they'll say, "Is it okay that we're here?" Yeah. They literally don't know because they just assume that there's this guilt. The next one, please. This is something I wanted to say. So after the 100-year commemorations, when I was in London, I spent the next week back in France. And all the emotion of being there at the commemorations, talking to so many people. I was interviewing a lot of people in London in pubs about what remembrance means to them and all of that. And I was back in France. And so I went to this cemetery, this German cemetery, and it really affected me in a big way. So I'd never been to the cemetery before. The cemetery has 16,000 graves. And in those 16,000 graves, there was one bouquet of flowers. Wow. And it really hit me. I had all this emotion and sentiment in London, and here I am, and here's one bouquet of flowers. And for me, what it translated into, because you're sitting there and you have nothing to do, you're just thinking about all this stuff, is 100 years later, it isn't 100 comrades. It's not 100 enemies. What I felt 100 years later was 16,000 crying mothers. That's what I felt. Because 100 years later, that's really the only thing that still exists. You know what I mean? Is that energy from 16,000 crying mothers. Next one, please. This is an example of one of the British cemeteries. Again, this is where they'll have 25 guys that all died on the same day in many instances. And then 1,000 yards away will be another cemetery. It's really interesting, this idea of remembrance and what it means to them. I was at a cemetery similar to this once. It was a Canadian cemetery. And a lot of times, they don't have McDonald's out there. So you buy a baguette and some meat and some cheese and you kind of go about your day. And a lot of times when I'm there, I'm photographing, I'm being artistic and whatnot. And so I was there having lunch, and I very often will photograph the unknown soldiers' graves, because I find those interesting. And the greenskeepers were there. And they leave. And now I'm a little bit away from the cemetery. I'm shooting wider shots and stuff. And a car pulls up. And a guy runs across the field at me. And I'm like, this guy's running at me. He's in a coat and everything, whatever. It's very weird. And I said, hey, I'm not making any trouble. You know what? I'm just taking some pictures, whatever. And he comes up, no, are you the man that was in the cemetery? And I said, yes. And he goes, I'm the local war graves commissioner. Are you a descendant? Can I help you? Do you need a hotel? Do you need a place to eat?
Wow.
You need any information? And I said, no, this is crazy. He goes, no one comes anymore.
Yeah.
Especially Canadians, you know, because they're not close like the British. And that was very telling. You know, these moments that you have, you know, where you connect with people, it's really, really interesting in that regard. You know, so I have this documentary. I'm trying to find these 30 men. I found 6 of them. I may or may not find descendants. And so somebody had asked me once, so what's the end of your documentary? What is it for you? So I have one photograph that I never show. And it is a photograph of a crashed biplane. And so the biplane has crashed, it's still smoking. The pilot has died and he is laying there dead. You can see his hand. Can't really see his face, you can see his hand. And when I was a child, my grandfather showed me the photograph. He got visibly upset. And he cried like a baby. And he cried and he just kept saying, that poor boy, that poor boy. That's what he said. And so what it was, I came to find out, it was the first dead body he had seen. He was 16 years old, and it was the first dead body he had seen. And seeing the photograph brought that emotion right back, brought it right to the surface, and he put it right into me. Because I'm a kid. Your grandpa cries like a baby. It scares you, you know? Went right into me. So the end of the documentary is this. And this came to me in 2018. In this photograph, which I never show people, the only thing identifiable is the tail of the airplane. And the tail has a number. So I cropped the photograph and sent it out to my network of historians. Within 24 hours, I had the name of the pilot, the photo of the pilot, the account of the incident, which corroborated the location of my grandpa's story, and the location of the pilot's grave.
Wow.
And so the end, and I've been to the cemetery before, but I've never been to the grave. The end of the documentary is going to be, what is in it for me is, I am going to go to the grave of this soldier who my grandfather was there at his moment of death and lay a wreath to give my grandfather that thread of remembrance and to take the energy he put into me and to find that closure. And that's the end of the documentary. Yeah. And so it's interesting because, like I said, early on, I had made this connection to my grandpa's wartime experience. I knew where he was. I spent more time on the battlefield than he did, really, in the mud. And now what it's kind of come to be, this idea of teaching people about remembrance, because, you know, here it is, peace, right? Peace. How can we have peace? How can we have peace in Palestine? How can we have peace in Africa? How can we have peace? And somebody told me a while back, they said, you need to read Mandela. And the interesting thing about reading Mandela is that his whole idea is that the path to peace is through forgiveness. And forgiveness is always the biggest and the hardest step. And you can either grant forgiveness or ask for forgiveness. This is why guys go back to Vietnam. You know, they want that closure, that connection, right? So if I can, through this exhibit, and I want to have the museum exhibit, the documentaries and everything, really instill this idea that forgiveness is the path to peace, that's the remembrance that I want to give. That's what my grandpa's pictures are actually helping me do that for the world and for humanity. And so that's actually his gift to me, is with these photographs. And I am sure he would have been blown away. My mother she can't believe it that I found her any of these pictures where nobody knew they had any historical significance at all. Yeah. And I'm still discovering things all the time, and that's part of the fun. The adventure continues. Trust me, it's pretty crazy, and it's a whole lot of fun.
What an amazing life he led.
Yes, he did. You know, he came to the States and had his business, and there's a whole other story about him. He went back to Germany once. He went back in 1939. He was exhibitioning in a photography exhibit in Czechoslovakia. And he stopped home to his village to see his mother, and he went into the corner bar in this village, and he got drunk. And he kind of talked about, as an American, about what he felt about the current government. Oh. And my grandpa got arrested by the Gestapo and spent a month in jail in 1939. Oh. And got out just in the nick of time. Wow. And I actually have reconnected with my relatives in Germany and actually was there in the village, in the house my grandpa was born in, and the relative said, did you hear when your grandpa got arrested? It's still the biggest news that ever happened in that town. It's pretty funny, except for the one British tank that rolled in 1945. So it's pretty crazy, you know. So, but yes, he lived a very charmed life, but he would say that, you know, his great joy was being a grandfather, and so that's been that great gift. He was like my father, so it was really something special, really something special. And if you can go to the next picture, there he is. So that's my grandpa, and that's me as a little kid. So, like I said, and for him, it was all about peace. He didn't feel any pride. You know, it wasn't that war experience. You know, he said, you know, it's just it's horrible. You know, and he experienced as a child, and you know, that's the thing that's so horrible. And you know, being an artist, you know, you look at a lot of the artists, the poets, the writers that went through that wartime experience, the Hemingways, the Disneys. You know, that experience carried through with them, and he was a part of that. And so it's pretty amazing, pretty amazing. So. So that's the end of my pictures. I'm trying to think of any other crazy stories. Again, it's pretty fun. You know, you go with your kids and they run out in the field, and my 8-year-old will go, "Dad, a hand grenade." I'm like, "Do not pick it up. Please do not pick it up." You know, stuff like that. The aerial photographs alone, I really have not dug in on. You know, and so a lot of the German aerial photographs, because remember the Germans were photographing the British. So a lot of the German aerial photographs did not survive World War II. So a lot of these assets don't exist. So the idea is, why were the Germans photographing this place at this time? Mm-hmm. And so there's all these interesting stories to tell. And so as a museum exhibit, I take every photograph as a story and then try to dig in and figure out what that story is.
Okay.
So pretty fun.
Do you have some time for questions?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anybody?
So, do we have anyone on YouTube channel that's
Hello,
got
YouTube.
some questions?
Absolutely.
Is my son on?
Thank you so much, Ken. First question from the chat. Thank you, everyone, so much for tuning in.
Oh, great.
In this picture,
Yes.
who was it thought that he was talking to, and who was he actually talking to?
They thought he was talking to one particular officer, and it because of the way he was standing and whatnot, and it turned out to be, if I remember correctly, a friend of his father's.
And what's the significance of that difference?
I think it was just about the timing and of the place. It was this particular commander was of this airfield, and like I said, this particular airfield, Boistroncourt, was the home of the Greentails, which was the most successful unit of World War I, more so than even Richtoven's unit. And your kids can land there in the video game. And if you watch the movie the Blue Max with George Peppard, there is a scene where the pilot that he's competing with crashes into a smokestack. That is supposed to be the smokestack at that airfield. Okay. And the smokestack is still there, so yeah.
So I have a question. With all these fantastic photos, how is it that he maintained possession of those? I'm sure he took lots and lots of them that he handed in to the authorities
Yes.
or whatever. But he saved some of these things, or what?
He either had them at home or brought them home and then brought them to America and put them in an album, and they sat in his basement for the 14 years of my life. And when he died, I brought them home, and they sat for another 20 years. And I dusted them off in 2014 and decided I was going to go find them. That's what it was. And it was only because of the terror attack in Paris. I would have not been in Le Cateau. There was no fighting there. The Germans came in the middle of the night in 1914, and it wasn't until the British rolled through just before the war that there was any fighting there. So I would have never been in that town. I would have never found it, any of it. Because those pictures of the Kaiser, it was a secret meeting because it was in the midst of this tank battle. They had captured the British tank. They were there to study it. And actually, one of the things I've been able to hypothesize is that the generals were fighting about how to respond. And the Kaiser got very involved with that conversation and then basically usurped himself, which led to the Kaiser's battle in March 1918, which basically was the beginning of the end of the war.
See, with those kinds of odds, you should be spending your time in Vegas instead.
Yeah, I know. And there's so much more I could show. I mean, I don't have time. I mean, there's hundreds of photographs, and many of which have never been seen. But there are actually, as I said before, there are those two images where you see my grandpa with the camera and those film cameras, and I have that film footage. And it shows my grandpa in the film footage. So it's pretty crazy. Pretty crazy.
Jeff Holmes, 1148. John, you're so articulate, and World War I seems like such a distant war to me, like Napoleonic War or something. You've really humanized it tonight. But you also talked about what your grandfather did after the war. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? I thought that was very interesting. You talked
sure.
about it over dinner.
Sure, of course. So he had immigrated to Chicago. He had one sister that had come before him, and he was an apprentice on a studio in Clark Street, and then eventually bought the business. So he had his studio, and then bought the building, and he sold the building 2 weeks after I was born. He basically spent his whole life in that one building. And he, so in the 1920s, really the only people that could afford a studio photographer were literally gangsters. And so he did a lot of gangster weddings and things like that in the 1920s. And he was married, engaged to my grandmother, and somebody they had done a wedding for was killed in a gangland thing. And my grandma said, "I'm not going to marry you." And so he decided to change his entire business. And he created a volume business where he specialized in photographing children. Because in Chicago, being an immigrant community, you could not pick up the phone or email the grandparents in Hungary and say how the kids were, so you'd send a picture postcard. That's what they did for these European communities, whether you're in Lithuania, Hungary, whatever. In fact, that's how my grandpa met my grandma met my grandfather, that she went in to take a picture to send home to Hungary. Okay, so so what he did is he patented. And I have a picture of it. I'm sorry I don't have it on here, but he basically, you're taking a picture of a baby, right? So he patented this giant rabbit that went on the camera, and the lens came out of the stomach, and the baby always looked at the rabbit. Baby looked at the rabbit in 1928. The baby looked at the rabbit in 1968. And it became an institution in Chicago. So if there's any members out there from Chicago, go check your baby pictures. It probably says Bunnygraph. And that is the name of my production company, actually. So that's what he did. And so it's an institution in Chicago for 50 years. My logo is his logo. And he loved children. And that was just, what he did. That was his life.
What a great story.
Yeah. So.
John, I'm just curious here.
Yeah.
I know that there was a big difference in terms of how the Germans built their trenches versus how the French or the British built their trenches. And
Yes.
in some of your research, especially that fortification on the Maginot Line,
Yes.
did you notice or have any kind of personal connections or takes to the difference in kind of
Totally.
fortifications
Yeah.
between the nations?
Yes, so if you saw the movie 1917, the Oscar-nominated film, there's a scene in there where all of a sudden the Germans have disappeared. What happened? And so that's basically what they did. They basically had their trenches, which, they basically met each other, you know what I mean? Built their trenches, but then realized they needed to have more fortifications. They were worried about what was going on. So they basically built the Hindenburg Line with all of those layers of defense, all that concrete, all those pillboxes, and then basically retreated to that point, giving it up. Because the thing was, the British then took over the previous German trenches, which they knew where they were. So they basically stepped into somebody's house that they knew.
Yeah.
Excuse me, and that ended up becoming a big problem. So the trenches were unbelievable. I mean, all that is still there, all these different things. It's pretty amazing, just the infrastructure of the things that are there. It's pretty insane. Yeah, pretty insane.
All right. Well, Steve, you got a question?
And it's amazing how many maps there are really of it.
In what year did your grandfather die, and how old were you?
He died in 1984, and I was 13.
And how old was he?
He was 84. He was born in the 1800s, just the end of the 1800s.
So as a former backseater, I have to ask what unit your grandfather flew and photographed with, and if you know what kind of airplane he was operating, any of those details.
Yeah, I mean, I have some pictures that show the reconnaissance planes, the two-seaters. A lot of the pictures that are in the album are of the triplanes, the DR-1 and the Fokker D-7, which was actually the last plane that the Germans had, which was a pretty good plane. There is one photograph I didn't put in here because I'm kind of not really circulating it much, but something that's come about very recently with it, which is pretty interesting, is I was meeting with a historian in Belgium. And actually it kind of translates into my grandfather's end of the war experience. So after Cambrai, his unit was moved to Belgium, and his captain had a dog. And I actually have a picture of this dog sitting behind the wheel of a car. And my grandfather and his comrades had a cat. And the dog killed the cat. And my grandpa and his comrades killed the dog.
Oh.
So my grandfather actually spent the last 4 months of the war in a 3-man machine gun crew in Belgium.
Oh.
So he actually did see the trenches at the end of the war. That's where he was at the end. And so I have this aerial photograph of a biplane. So the biplane is flying and it's being taken from another plane, okay? And so I was meeting with this historian in Ypres in Belgium, And I said, oh, here's his picture. And he goes, that's Belgium, because the fields are smaller. That's not France, that's Belgium. And there was a crossing at a river, and he goes, I think I can find where that picture's taken, because he's like, tracks everything. So the revelation has become, if you look in on my high quality scan of the photo, you can see the pilot's goggles looking up at him taking the picture. So now I thought that's pretty strange. So clearly he was wanting him to take a picture because it's of the airplane flying. So that picture was found in a photo album by the US Army in 1945. And it is actually in the Library of Congress. And there is something on the airplane in my grandpa's picture, it's in the album, that may say who the pilot is. So does anybody know who took over for Manfred Richtofen after he died?
Oh, it was the Air Force of World War II.
Hermann Goering.
Oh.
And so we think the picture that my grandpa took is of Hermann Goering flying, because that picture is in Goering's World War I album that the Americans captured at the end of the war. So pretty crazy.
Pretty amazing.
Is it a two-seater that he's flying, or is it a single-seat D7?
He was not a pilot, so no, the D7 it was a two-seater.
The photograph, Goering's, because he's a fighter squadron commander at the time.
Yes.
But is he flying a two-seater, or is he flying a?
It wasn't a triplane. It wasn't a triplane. It was I think it was an albatross actually, but he had a very specific color pattern on it. Yeah, funny enough, it was a white stripe from the back of his head to the tail, which the white stripe, you know what that means? When a white stripe goes down your back.
Oh.
Very fitting for Goering, so I just thought that was funny. But it's really interesting. I mean, what's been so amazing is that I've had these crazy discoveries, you know, finding the guy with the book, with all the British records, with the numbers of the tanks, you know what I mean? Rolling into that town, into La Coteau, figuring out how to talk to the librarian at the museum, meeting the mayor who spoke English, you know what I mean? All these different things that have come about. Doing the podcast in London. Another crazy story is I was in London for the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme, which of course is the biggest day in British history, right? 60,000 men died in what day? And so what it was happening in London was there was a requiem the night before with the Queen. They were going to be in the church all evening, and then in the morning, at 6 in the morning, they were going to have a special service. So I decided I was going to go to that service at 6 in the morning at Westminster Abbey. So I wake up in the morning, and it's raining. It's pouring down. And I'm like, oh, hell, it's on TV. I should just stay in my room and watch it. I said, no, I'm going to go, right? Showing up is 180% of life, right? So of course, it's crazy security. So I jump out of the car like 4 or 6 blocks from at Westminster Abbey. It's pouring. And now another car pulls up, and these 3 guys get out, and they're old guys. And they're old guys, and they've got the ribbons on their blazer. You know, these are veterans, right? And they've got these duffel bags. And I'm like, let me help you guys. So I'm the young guy, right? So I run over and I grab their duffel bags. Oh, thank you so much. So I've got my blazer on, I've got my red poppy pin on, and he goes, are you Canadian? And they go, I go, no, I'm American. And he goes, I said, I'm really honored to go to this service today, but I just come from the battlefields in France, and I'm really interested in the Battle of Cambrai. And he goes, oh, we love Cambrai, we're tankers, these guys. So we're walking. So the only reason why I got to talk to these guys, we're walking the 4 blocks in the rain. I got these bags. They can't lose me because I got their shit, right? So I get to the door, and I'm like, oh, I'd love to. And I'm showing him some pictures while we're walking. He goes, that's amazing, it's amazing. And I said, he goes, here's my card if there's ever anything I can do. So he gives my card, and it says, General so-and-so and so, Commandant of Sandhurst.
Oh.
So it turns out this guy is the most highly decorated British tank commander of the Gulf War.
Wow.
And he sits on the board of the Prince's Trust. And so I just meet these people with such significance, these contacts. So it's great. You know, it's just a matter of something out there is trying to help me make this happen. So I just keep going, and you know, maybe I'm going to take it to a certain point, and my son will take it someday, or somebody else will take it someday. You know, there's some specific things I need. I'm going to put it out there right now to all the Adventure Club community. You know, I'm really trying to find an institutional partner for the collection because I think it should be researched. You know what I mean? There's a lot I want to do with it, but I want it to become a permanent collection. And I've talked to some places, but you know, if anybody has any ideas about relationships and whatnot, that'd be great. And then I'm basically self-funded. You know, that's what it is. So it's one of those things. But I'm having a lot of fun with it. It's a big adventure, I'll tell you that. So
if anyone wants to find out more.
Yes. So Yeah, the URL is Return to Lakato 1917. That is the name of it, which will basically take you to a Facebook page because that's the easiest way to be connected. And then my hashtag, actually, and I was really thinking about it, with the documentary and the message is, it's Bring Them Home Again. And that's really what it's
Great
about,
tag.
Bring Them Home Again. Yep. So, thank you.
John.
Well, I hope someday to screen the film here. Like I said, it'd be great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, John, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Very enjoyable, very informative.
Thank
Really
you.
enjoyed having you out and you coming out to visit us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
For those of you out in YouTube land, thank you for tuning in. Subscribe, like this, comment if you liked it, and tune in next week. We'll have another interesting program for you. Good night from the Adventurers Club.